This lecture is on types of third-party interventions. And it's just designed to give you kind of a map of the space of services that would be available to you if you do need to bring in a third party. And I also want to just start by briefly remarking that when we talk about third-party interventions, it's not always for dispute resolution. I mean, in practice, it's typically for dispute resolution, but that's because people wait until things break to bring in a mediator or an arbitrator or a facilitator. You can take advantage of third-party interventions to bring in a facilitator before things get bad. So an example from my own experience is from back when I was mediating in Maryland, where yes, most of what we did was conflict resolution. People waited until things get bad. But there was one time when I had a case that came to us that was just, it was much like Fillmore Lawns. It was a multi-party, multi-issue negotiation. There was a community zoning board that determined land use in the area. This was in Baltimore. There was a neighborhood association that didn't have any legal power but had strong interests. And there was a business that wanted to develop a plot of land. And then there was a representative from the city. And the business wanted to develop a plot of land, and they'd approach some of these individuals to get their opinion. So they brought in a mediator just to facilitate the conversation because they knew there was a lot of moving parts. They knew there was a lot of things to work out and a lot of interest to meet. So they brought in a facilitator before things get bad. And you can also think about third-party interventions not always as bringing an outside service, but as something you yourself can do. So you may sometimes, as a manager, be party to a dispute, but you may also, as a manager, be a third party to a dispute. So you can take that role with your own employees as well. And finally, I just want to mention a term to you, ADR. It stands for Alternative Dispute Resolution, and it's kind of a catch-all for the broad field of people like mediators and arbitrators who are providing this kind of service. So, okay, the remainder of this video will just briefly define three of the most common terms in this space. So one of the most common terms is arbitration. Now, arbitration is becoming increasingly popular. You'll even see it written into contracts. People say, in breach of contract, if there's an issue, we must go to arbitration. And not only that, they may even specify an arbitrator. That's not exactly a great thing because arbitration is a legally binding process, or at least this is what it is in the United States. It's a legally binding process where someone listens to the case, so they'll listen to both sides of the case, they hand down a decision, and that's the outcome. So it's basically like a private court in terms of the outcome that you get. However, you may or may not have a choice of the arbitrator, especially if it's written into a contract. They may have chosen the arbitrator because they know they tend to give favorable outcomes. So, but it has a lot of advantages. It still can be far faster and far more affordable, less costly than going to court. And so, who are the arbitrators? They're typically retired judges, although they sometimes may simply be attorneys, but they're almost always, or probably always, someone with a legalistic background. Okay, so another form of third-party intervention, similar to arbitration, is a settlement conference. Now, a settlement conference, unlike arbitration, is not necessarily legally binding, but like arbitration, it is a process where someone will give you a solution. So typically, again, it's going to be either attorneys or judges who will listen to a case. And in this case, the parties are typically represented by attorneys. In fact, the parties may not even be in the room, and the attorneys may or may not even be in the same room. But the person running the process, the judge or the lead attorney, will listen to both sides of the case, and they'll make a recommendation. They'll make an evaluation that typically might say something like, well, if you were to go to court, here's what would likely happen. And then people say, oh, well, that's what's going to happen when we go to court. Again, it's all about saving the time and money associated with going to court. Now, one of the things that you'll typically hear, at least I hear behind the scenes when I'm talking with the people who are doing this, is that it's impossible to truly make an evaluation about what would happen if you go to court because different judges will give different outcomes. And I've spoken with people who have served as arbitrators or evaluative facilitators, and evaluative means they're giving an evaluation. And they say that they don't really like to do that because they know that it's not really the best thing for the parties, but they do that because parties often expect it of them. They really want it. They're hiring them to come in and give an evaluation. So they're doing that because of their job, but even they know it's not necessarily the best thing for the party. But again, it's a matter of time and money. So like all things, there are cases where it's appropriate. And then finally, the service that I know and love, and that you've heard me talk about quite a bit, is mediation. Mediation is a process where a facilitator will run a conversation, and the participants will determine the outcome. Right. So you'll actually get a demo video, a little bit of what one example of this looks like. Now, I take a pretty strongly non-interventionist approach as a mediator. I take a very strong policy of not giving any advice or suggestions. That's not necessarily going to be true of all mediators, but most mediators will agree that that's usually the best thing for the participants, because participants usually know their situation better. And generally speaking, when people in a dispute come up with their own solution rather than having it handed down by a judge or an arbitrator, they're more likely to stick to it in the long run. It's more integrative, it's more sustainable. So just some things to consider if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're either wanting to bring in a mediator or you're participating in mediation. Some issues to consider: some people engage in what's called shuttle diplomacy, and that shuttle diplomacy is a type of mediation. I hesitate to even call it mediation, where the parties aren't in the same room, but the mediators are going back and forth between the parties. This is particularly common at the corporate levels for mediation between firms. It's less common for interpersonal or small claims court type mediations. And again, when I talk to the people who run these processes, they say they usually do it because it's what the participants want and expect, not necessarily because it's what will get the best outcome. Another thing to consider is the role of evaluation and advice. I already talked a little bit about that, but it's a question of whether the mediator should give recommendations or whether they should just facilitate a process. I will always argue that a mediator is serving their participants best when they are facilitating the process. And there, especially when there are attorneys in the room, there's already plenty of opinions to go around. And it's while the mediator may speak sometimes with more authority, they're not necessarily going to have a better solution than the people who have already been really living this situation. And then finally, something very important to consider with mediation is your goals and your time investment, or your willingness to invest time. Mediation can be a long and slow process, because remember, the goal is not to satisfy, but to optimize, right? If you want to satisfy, if you just want to get a satisfactory solution to just move things along, you might try a more evaluative process of settlement, conference, and arbitration. But if you really want to optimize, if you really want to find what's best for everybody, what's going to be most sustainable in the long run, that could be mediation, but it takes a long time. So those are just some things to consider. And of course, I am always available to you for consultation about the services. I probably will not be available as a mediator, especially now that I'm not neutral since we know each other. But I'm more than happy to help you to navigate this space and find a service that would work for you if you do need to bring in some sort of third-party intervention, or if you find yourself in a management position where you need to be that third party. We could talk about how to design different processes. So just some thoughts about third-party interventions and a sort of guidebook to how you can navigate that space. And this concludes the lecture, Types of Third-Party Intervention.